Thank you for staying with us here on Missouri Viewpoints and caring enough about the issues that matter to be a part of this program. We just heard from the Missouri NEA's Ann Jarrett on a somewhat new approach to public education called Common Core, and that's being met with some vocal pushback here in the Show Me State and in other states as well. And the NEA doesn't have a formal position on Common Core standards, although their position is it's here, it's the reality, so we have to deal with it, more or less. So what is the problem with Common Core? Dr. James Shuls is with the Show Me Institute. He's an education policy analyst, and he's got some thoughts on that. James, welcome back to Missouri Viewpoints.
Thank you so much for having me.
And congratulations on the new designation of doctor with your PhD.
Thank you. It's very honored to have that degree.
Now, let's go right to the Common Core standards. We just heard from the Missouri NEA a few minutes ago, and the way it's being explained is this is focusing, to start with at least, on concepts of core issues, core topics in schools, core subject matter, and it is a way to say nationally we don't compete at a local level anymore economically, we compete on a global level, and we need to increase the education performance of our students. What could be wrong with that?
Well, there are a bunch of different things going on here. I mean, for one, we could talk about the standards and the quality of the standards. There's a lot of debate about the quality of the standards, whether or not these really are rigorous standards. There's another debate going on about whether or not standards even matter, if they even improve education. And then the larger debate, the one that's really causing a lot of controversy, is what should be the federal government's role in this, their involvement in this? Does the federal government have a right to impose standards on states? And then with that, another part of that controversy is the data collection. What data are they going to be collecting? And so when we talk about Common Core state standards, we're not just talking about the standards, we're talking about many big issues.
Now, supporters of Common Core say, well, the federal government isn't mandating them, it's an agreement among states, and somebody's written this up. Is the federal government imposing a top-down standard with Common Core?
Well, I like to say that the Common Core standards are state-led in the loosest sense of the word. So the federal government got heavily involved in this. They gave $300 million to help develop the assessments for the tests, for the standards. They helped encourage states to adopt the standards through the Race to the Top initiative, which is a $4 billion federal stimulus program. They further encouraged states to adopt the standards through the No Child Left Behind waivers. The president celebrated the adoption of these standards in his State of the Union address. The Democratic platforms congratulated the president for helping states adopt these standards. So there very much has been a federal involvement here. Now, you can choose to participate and you can choose not to participate, but there are a whole lot of strings attached to it which have enticed states to participate in the standards.
Now, with the argument that we are in a global economy, and I don't think there's a debate there, we are in a global economy and technology has changed, is there a place for there to be a national expectation when it comes to education as opposed to the good old days when what was important in Florida may not be what's important here in the Show Me State and may be very different than what's important in Colorado or Wyoming? Do we have to think nationally and globally when it comes to education to give each child the best education?
Well, we absolutely want high standards for our kids, and we want our kids to excel and to achieve. But that doesn't necessarily mean that these standards need to be centrally imposed. So if you look at all the other countries of the world, the countries that perform above us, many of them do have national standards, but so do the ones who perform below us. And there's not really any evidence that national standards will improve education outcomes. Even if we look at the states that have supposedly great standards, oftentimes they're not the states that are performing very well. There's actually a great study done by Tom Lovelace of the Brookings Institution that looked at the quality of standards and the performance of those states. And he found basically no correlation. The correlation was actually negative 0.06. So there's really no relationship to the quality of standards in a state and the performance of students.
We're visiting with Dr. James Shuls from the Show Me Institute as an education policy analyst. Okay, with Common Core, and of course it's become kind of a political lightning rod, a lot of accusations that it is the left trying to impose and indoctrinate not just curriculum but values on children. Do you find anything in Common Core that backs that up, or is that missing the point and maybe creating a little bit of white noise?
I think there's a little bit of white noise, but the standards are being opposed not just by people on the right. People on the right are concerned about the federal government's imposition of these standards. They're concerned about all the stuff you just mentioned. People on the left are also concerned about big business involvement. They're concerned about the Gates Foundation and the testing companies and all these different types of things. So there are all kinds of people from both sides of the aisle that are concerned about the standards. Now, if we look at the standards themselves, I don't necessarily see anything in the standards that say that districts have to do it one way that would impose some sort of left-wing ideology. But the standards do, in my mind, encourage a certain type of instruction, and you heard that here from your previous guest, saying that they're focusing more on skills and practices, and they're moving away from, in my mind, knowledge and discrete facts and standard algorithms for mathematics. So they are moving more towards a progressive ideology in teaching practices.
If Common Core standards are not the answer to improve education, because I don't think anybody will question that we have a struggling education system, not just in the state but in the nation. What is the solution to improve education? Because what it comes down to is what we should be talking about is how will each child in the country and in our state have access to the best education opportunity. And what they do with it's up to them, but at least have access to the best opportunity.
Right, well, you bring up a very good question. So Common Core suggests that if we set standards, we test students, we can get all students to achieve very well. So it's very much centrally imposed. We have to put all sorts of mechanisms in place to make sure teachers are teaching to the standards and they're doing a good job, and we have to hold them accountable and all of that. And that's one idea of accountability and how we can move forward. But in my mind, a much better idea is giving parents more autonomy, more ability to choose their child's school. And so through school choice, they're going to demand rigorous standards from their school. They're going to demand that the school does a great job educating their children. And through school choice, allowing schools to customize and meet the needs of students, that's really how we're going to improve education in Missouri and in the nation.
One of the things that was brought up in the previous segment and something you mentioned just a few minutes ago is the data collection that's happening. The position has been taken that it's the same information that's been collected off a standardized test for a long time. What are the concerns with what is being collected, and why should people at least know about it?
Well, again, here's where the Common Core is one thing and data collection is something a little bit different, but they are lumped together. So when we applied for our waiver from No Child Left Behind, and when we tried to get Race to the Top, in both of those there are requirements, or you're looked favorably upon if you develop these longitudinal data systems. So this longitudinal data system would track students over time, and so you can ideally see how they're performing. But along with that, there was a national model of data that states should collect, and it does include a lot more data than what we're collecting now. And so we could say, yes, we're not going to collect anymore, but it does open the door for possible more collection to happen in the future.
What kind of information is being collected and tracked?
Well, right now, I mean, they ask things about your IEP status, if you have an individualized education program, family income, your performance on the tests, and I would say for the most part these things are collected through very secure means, and you can't identify the students. But as you brought up earlier, we see a lot of problems with data being breached and all kinds of other errors in handling these things, that it does bring about a lot of legitimate concerns. So I think the one thing that they could do is start allowing parents to opt out. Now,
you've mentioned that your position is give parents more power to put the pressure on their local school boards. Educators, education associations, and governments say this is not going to take away any autonomy from the states or any autonomy from the local school districts. It's just saying, here is where we want to emphasize the subject matter. You figure out what's the best way to get it from your local community. Is this something that could affect the local school district's ability to provide education tailored to their communities?
Schools have some flexibility, but there is absolutely the risk that this leads to further and further control from the government. So you can't just say we're going to have standards. You put in standards in place, then you have to have tests. And then after the tests are in place, you have to figure out, well, how do we get students to do well in that? And so you start developing curriculum. And then you have curriculum pacing guides, and you start getting into the really nitty-gritty day-to-day operation of a school, and the standards do start making more and more imposition on the schools.
Now, does Common Core address what's been a criticism for several years of when standardized tests are involved at all, teaching to the test, so to speak? In other words, school districts saying, you know, these are the 50 questions that are going to be asked. Instead of focusing on the entire subject matter, we're going to focus on these 50 questions for the semester. Does Common Core address that, or does it encourage it or discourage it in any way?
Well, I would say it's just as bad under Common Core as it is under any other testing regime. I mean, anytime you have a test in place, people are going to be trying to figure out how to game the system, how to get their scores artificially raised on the test. And so, I mean, this is another criticism of standards-based accountability. When you do these types of things, it leads to all sorts of perverse outcomes that aren't really what you intended in the first place.
Okay, Dr. James Shuls from the Show Me Institute. We just have a minute or so left. Somebody wants to keep up with your education policy, analyst blogs and papers and all the work that you do. What's the best way to do it?
Well, you can check us out online at showmedaily.org. That's our blog, and find us online at showmeinstitute.org.
Yep, and showme.org will get you right there as well. So when parents are consuming all of the information about Common Core, because I'm a fairly intelligent guy, and I hear both sides, and there are parts of it that just confuse me. What are the one or two main questions they need to be asking to understand why this really matters to them? It's not just another media battle.
Well, I think what parents really need to do now, I mean, the standards are being implemented in Missouri, and there's no real sign of them stopping. So what they need to do is get involved with your school. Pay attention to what's changing in terms of curriculum. Are they making any changes there? Are they making any changes in terms of how teachers are teaching? And really get engaged in what your school is doing, because schools could do a good job implementing these standards, but you have to stay on top of them.
All right, James Shuls from the Show Me Institute, thank you so much for coming by today.
Thank you.
All right, and thank you once again for joining me on the program and being a part of Missouri Viewpoints. On behalf of Lindenwood University Television, I'm Mike Ferguson, and we'll talk to you again next week.